For thousands of years, alchemists were obsessed with the idea of turning stone into gold. Gold was seen as the most valuable commodity in the world. If you could create it, the levels of wealth and prosperity that could be in store for humanity were seen as limitless. But the alchemists were wrong. Gold is not the most valuable commodity in the world. Energy is. You see, gold is only as useful as the labour that it can buy you. But with cheap energy, mankind was able to utilise an infinite number of gadgets and machines and inventions that gave one man the capability of thousands. It is cheap energy unleashed from dense and abundant stores, harnessed and utilised as power, that transformed the world. With cheap energy, we unleashed a food revolution that lifted quite literally billions out of poverty. With cheap energy, we radically enhanced life expectancy and quality of life. With cheap energy, we were able to leave the fields en masse and enter factories, offices, and classrooms. And with cheap energy, Australia became one of the most prosperous nations, not only in our time, but throughout all of human history. But for sustained intergenerational prosperity, energy must not only be cheap, but also clean, reliable, and secure. Clean because we have a fundamental responsibility to steward our natural environment for the next generation. Because our nation, and indeed much of the world, relies upon the food and the fibre that we grow within our soils. Clean energy goes so much further than emissions. It speaks to pollution and land use. Reliable because baseload power gives stability in an economy. Reliable energy means that industry can develop, food can be stored hygienically, and hospitals can expand 24-hour care to our sick and vulnerable. And secure because energy security is national security. All of the guns, bullets, and soldiers in the world can't save you if your government can't guarantee steady and reliable power in a time of crisis. If the lights go off and society grinds to a halt, your safety and your sovereignty is at risk. All four of these considerations must be at all times held in a delicate balance, and an overemphasis on one of these components at the expense of the others will inevitably lead to a crisis. For example, energy generation with no recourse to environmental outcomes or public health disasters produced such issues as the Great Smog of London in 1952, which led to respiratory illnesses and is estimated to have caused up to 12,000 deaths. There are equally ample examples of what happens when energy security and reliability is cast by the wayside. The winter of discontent in the UK in the 70s, sparked by strikes in the coal industry, led to power cuts, reduced industrial productivity, and significant economic losses. Households were forced to endure blackouts, and some businesses were put on 3-day work week due to electricity rationing. Almost recently, you just need to look to the European gas crisis sparked by the invasion of the Ukraine, with Europe, and in particular Germany, being heavily reliant on Russian gas. Cheap, clean, reliable, secure. Australia has not been doing such a good job at holding these four crucial policy considerations in balance. We have arbitrarily legislated a commitment to 80% renewables by 2030 with little to no consideration of the trade-offs. And the trade-offs are legion. First, let's talk about reliability. For reliable electricity, you need a steady flow of baseload power, which is the constant electricity supply that meets our minimum energy needs 24/7. Traditionally, baseload power has come from sources that run continuously, like coal, natural gas, or nuclear plants. Now, as we shift towards renewables, like solar and wind, which are intermittent, meaning the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, especially at night time, replacing that constant baseload becomes a challenge. Batteries and hydro can fill some of those gaps, but if your batteries aren't fully charged or demand is higher than expected, it is very difficult to meet this shortfall. This here is a brilliant graph from Stephen Wilson that he terms the yawning gap. Now, there's quite a lot going on here, but some of the key takeaways, you can see there the black and the blue navy down the bottom, that's Australia's baseload needs. And then in the grey up the top there, that's the additional renewable capacity that we've added to the grid. And that line in the sand there if we continue on the path for the scheduled decommissioning of our coal-fired power fleet without bringing a like-for-like technology online, will create that looming gap in our baseload power. As Philippa said earlier, we can't afford to turn anything off until we're ready to turn something better on. So we're making a trade-off on reliability, but what about security? Well, 80 to 90% of the components in Australian solar panels and wind turbines and batteries come from China. And even if these products were to be manufactured here, we would still be totally reliant on China for the refinery of the critical minerals and rare earths that go into making them. Now, this has vast implications that goes far beyond energy generation, but nothing could be more foolish and short-sighted than to remodel our entire energy grid to be even more reliant upon Chinese refinery and imports. So we're trading off reliability and security, but surely renewables are cheaper, right? After all, sunshine and the wind are free. Well, let's go for a bit of an exercise here, and let's take the government's own costings and figures. And let's make a bit of a back-of-the-envelope calculation of how much the differing pathways would really cost. Now, I'm making 3 assumptions before I present this. So 1, all of our technologies will need to be replaced in the next 20 years or so. And so this chart assumes that in time, the whole grid will need to be updated, so no preference is given to existing generation. 2, the expected demand on the grid is estimated to be about 304 terawatt hours by 2035. So as a minimum, that's the benchmark we're building to. And 3, the costs I've used are based on a fixed point in time, and we haven't considered discounting as there are just far too many variables there for our purposes. Are you still with me? Okay, great. Okay, now when designing a grid, first you have to look at the piece of equipment that's actually generating the electricity. So in the case of renewables, this is your solar panels and wind turbines, and for our purposes, we've gone for a 50-50 split of both. But regardless of which way you cut it, the costs come out roughly the same. In the case of coal, these are our coal-fired power stations, and in the case of nuclear, our nuclear reactors. So here's the scores on the board so far, 304 terawatt hours. But there's more to the story. Generation is bound by a capacity factor. So in essence, you have the total potential that can be produced, and then you have the actual amount that that piece of equipment is running for. So, for on average, a nuclear power runs at a capacity factor of about 90%. Coal's a little bit lower at 70 to 80, and this has been factored into these costings. But renewables are much lower. They are around 32% for wind and 23% for solar. So to actually produce the same amount of electricity as coal or nuclear, you need to overbuild, which now looks like this. Now, the typical lifespan of a nuclear power plant is 60 to 80 years. The typical lifespan of a coal-fired power station is 40, but the typical lifespan of a solar panel or a wind turbine is 20 to 30 years. So let's take our lower bound for nuclear and say over a 60-year period, we have to replace renewables twice. Now let's add in our workers' wages and our operations costs. Now, the advantage of wind and solar is that it doesn't require a fuel source, which nuclear and coal do. So over the life cycle, you can expect coal and nuclear costs to look like this. Now, notoriously, you have to process and store the spent fuel from nuclear plants. Let's add those costs in. But the advantage of using a fuel source is that you can have 24-hour power. Unfortunately, renewables don't produce electricity when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, so you need storage. Enough storage to power an entire evening. So let's add this storage in, and this is a mixture of pumped hydro and batteries. And of course, batteries need replacing too, and being generous, these can last up to about 20 years, so they'll need to be replaced 2 more times. So we've just added those replacements in. But batteries don't produce electricity, they only store it. And this is only enough storage to keep the grid going for one night. So what happens if, say, we're in the middle of winter, and we have low sunlight and a wind drought, and we don't produce enough excess energy to charge our batteries for the following evening? And what happens when, like it did in June 2020, this wind drought lasts for 2 weeks? That would be very expensive. One option is to keep all of our existing gas turbines in operation. And that would mean a continued dependence upon fossil fuels, and we'd still have to pay for their replacements, operations, maintenance, and fuel. And in keeping with our net zero commitments, we'd have to offset those carbon emissions with carbon capture storage. But if you want to do it with renewables, then we need at the very least to triple our solar to cover for the lack of wind energy being produced and to produce enough excess to keep our batteries charged. So let's add in another scenario. So we've got on the left a fully renewable grid, and then just next to that we've got one that keeps gas as a backup. We then have to consider, how do we actually get the energy we've generated to the end user? So in the case of coal or nuclear, we can just use our existing sites and transmission in the grid. With renewables, on the other hand, you have to decentralise the grid. And you need transmission not only to the end user, but also hooked up to your storage. So let's add in our additional transmission costs. And then last but not least, we're going to consider our decommissioning costs. So let's add those in. And there you have it. This is what the differing pathways would cost to meet Australia's energy needs over the course of a generation. Right now, these two sticks on the left, we are right now on a path to 80% of this in the next 5 years. You will pay for this, all of you. We have a population of 27 million. That is $95 million each. And if you aren't paying for it in your energy bills, you will be paying for it in your taxes, or in the price of goods and services as these prices are passed off to consumers, or as we've heard from Peter earlier on today, it will be passed on to our children. And overwhelmingly, it is those on the lowest income distribution that feel the effect of increasing power prices the most. This is the pathway to systemic economic decline. So we've made these trade-offs: unreliable, insecure, and expensive, but surely this must mean that renewables are the cleanest and greenest. Well, no. We are actively destroying our natural environment in pursuit of an ideological affinity to renewable energy. Industrial wind and solar requires an enormous amount of land use. Solar requires 50 times the amount of land to produce the same amount of energy as coal or nuclear power. This graph here is what the Net Zero Steering Group proposes would be needed for a fully renewable and decarbonised economy by 2050. So the dark blue and orange, those massive installations in the middle, those are the solar and wind that will be required, and the pink is our transmission lines. Notice the size here and the solar Tasmanias. And this is what it would look like in practice. This is the industrial solar installation in Queensland, Daydream. This is what our entire countryside will look like. We've been told that this is clean and green energy. So, that's all doom and gloom, but what is the better story? Well, the good news is we actually know what to do, and we have known for a very long time. And it is the golden rule of engineering that has powered all of the massive breakthroughs and developments in energy over the last couple of 100 years, and that is the power of power density. That says the denser your embedded energy source, the cleaner and the cheaper, and the more productively that it can be utilised and harnessed and put to work as power. It is this principle that led us from burning biofuels like timber and peat to the Industrial Revolution of coal. It is this principle that meant we moved from burning animal fats to oil and gas, and it is this principle that will power the next revolution in energy generation, which 19 of the top 20 economies in the OECD are already using or planning to utilise, which is nuclear power. There are 3 points that I'd love to leave you with today. The first is this: whatever the political impulses of the day, by intentionally pushing up power prices, it is unconscionable and it is immoral for the energy transition to come off the backs of the poor. 2, when it comes to our coal-fired power stations, we can't afford to turn anything off until we're ready to turn something better on. And 3, there is a better story. To get the balance right between cheap, clean, reliable, and secure, you have to look to the power of power density. The denser the power, the cleaner and more prosperous your society. Thank you.